In September of 1942, Margaret O'Brien climbed to her attic for the first time in 15 years, driven by something she couldn't quite name, a restlessness that had been growing stronger with each passing month. At 53, she had learned to live with the weight of unanswered questions, but lately they had begun pressing against her chest like stones. The wooden box she found buried beneath her father's old winter coats was not the one she was looking for. She had come up here searching for her mother's china, thinking perhaps it was time to use the good dishes instead of saving them for occasions that never came. But the box was there, covered in dust that swirled in the late afternoon light, and something about its careful placement, hidden but not forgotten, made her hands tremble as she lifted the lid. The letters inside were yellowed with age, their edges soft as flower petals, but it was the one on top that made her sink into her father's chair, her breath coming in short gasps. The familiar handwriting, the date that had haunted her dreams for 3 decades, September 21st, 1912. For 30 years, Margaret had constructed elaborate theories about Thomas Sullivan's disappearance. She had convinced herself he was a coward who fled from commitment, or that he had never loved her at all, that their stolen conversations and whispered promises had been nothing more than a railroad man's entertainment in a dull small town. She had almost managed to believe these comfortable lies. But now, holding his letter in hands that had aged 30 years since the morning she waited for a train that never stopped, Margaret realized that the truth was something else entirely. Something that would explain not just why he never came back, but why she had never been able to stop waiting. The first line made her close her eyes. "My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, then I am already dead, and you must know that I kept my promise in the only way I could." But there were other letters in the box, letters that weren't from Tom at all, letters that would reveal how many people had known the truth she had been denied for 3 decades. And how the web of silence that surrounded his disappearance had been far more complex than one man's broken promise. Margaret took a deep breath that tasted of old wood and secrets kept too long, and prepared to discover that sometimes the cruelest kindness is letting someone believe they were abandoned, rather than telling them they were loved beyond all reason. Mill Valley, Massachusetts existed in the shadow of the Whitmore Textile Mill, a red brick fortress that squatted beside the Merrimack River like a sleeping giant. In 1912, the mill's whistle governed 400 lives with more authority than church bells or town clocks. It summoned workers at dawn, released them at dusk, and marked the rhythm of a community that existed solely to feed cotton into machines and produce cloth for a world beyond their narrow horizon. Margaret O'Brien was 19 that spring, with auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight and green eyes that held dreams too large for such a small place. She had worked since she was 14, first taking in piecework with her mother, then graduating to the mill floor when her father died in what the company called an industrial accident and her mother called murder by negligence. The accident had changed everything, not just because it left them without Patrick O'Brien's steady wages, but because it introduced Margaret to the arbitrary nature of loss. How quickly a life could be torn apart by forces beyond anyone's control. She learned early that the world was not safe, that promises could be broken by circumstances rather than choices, and that survival required building walls around your heart thick enough to withstand almost anything. Almost anything except the sound of the Boston and Maine locomotive that arrived 3 times each week. The afternoon freight came through Mill Valley on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays at exactly 3:47 p.m., stopping for precisely 12 minutes to take on water and coal. Margaret first noticed the locomotive's approach not because of its schedule, which she knew by heart, like everyone else in town, but because of the way its whistle seemed to carry a different melody than the other trains that passed through without stopping. She was helping to repair storm damage in the mill's east wing when she heard it that Tuesday in March. Something made her look toward the station, perhaps the way the whistle seemed to linger in the air, more musical than mechanical. That's when she saw him. Thomas Sullivan stood beside his locomotive with the easy confidence of a man who understood the language of steam and steel. Even at a distance, Margaret could see the careful way he moved as he checked gauges and spoke with the station master. When he looked up toward the mill, their eyes met across 200 yards of muddy ground, and Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not the flutter of girlish attraction, but a recognition as deep and certain as the river's current. Later, she would wonder if that moment had been pure chance or something closer to fate. The storm that brought them together had blown out half the mill's windows, forcing the workers outside just as the afternoon freight arrived. If the weather had been clear, if she had been at her station in the weaving room, if Tom had been focused on his instruments instead of surveying the storm damage, their entire story might never have begun. But it did begin with that first exchange of glances that felt like the answer to a question Margaret hadn't known she was asking. Tom was 24, the son of an Irish immigrant who had worked himself to death laying railroad track across New England. He carried his father's pocket watch, not from sentiment, but from necessity. Railroad men lived and died by precise timing. He sent half his wages to his widowed mother in Chicago and dreamed of seeing every mile of track between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But he had never dreamed of Mill Valley until Margaret O'Brien looked at him like he was worth noticing. Their second encounter happened the following Thursday, when Margaret was hanging laundry behind Murphy's boarding house, where she rented a third-floor room barely large enough for a bed and a washstand. She had timed her chores carefully, though she would have died rather than admit such calculation to herself. When Tom raised his hand and a tentative wave, she felt her cheeks burn red as her hair. The third meeting was on Saturday, when Margaret convinced herself that a walk to the Mercantile couldn't possibly be timed to coincide with the 3:47 train. Tom approached her with his cap in his hands like a schoolboy, asking permission to speak. "Miss," he said, his voice carrying the soft burr of County Cork, "I hope you don't think me forward, but I've been wondering, might I know your name?" "Margaret O'Brien," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady.
And you're Thomas Sullivan. Everyone knows the engineer who keeps perfect time." "Tom," he corrected. And when he smiled, Margaret understood why Irish poets wrote about hearts breaking from too much beauty. From that first conversation, measured in precious minutes between his arrival and departure, Margaret began to structure her entire week around Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Tom would find her wherever she happened to be, and she made sure to be findable. And they would walk Mill Valley's brief main street with the intensity of people who knew their time was limited. He told her about places he had seen from his locomotive cab, wheat fields in Kansas that looked like golden oceans, mountains in Colorado that scraped heaven's belly, cities where electric lights turned night into day. Margaret had never traveled beyond Lawrence, 15 miles downriver, but in Tom's stories she journeyed to the ends of the earth.
She told him about books she borrowed from the tiny library above Henderson's store, tales of adventure and romance that made her small life feel even smaller. About poems she wrote in her mother's old Bible margins, verses about freedom and wild places and love that could survive anything. "You should see Boston, Maggie," Tom would say, using the name only he was allowed to speak. "The theater district lit up on Saturday nights, swan boats in the public garden, places big enough for dreams like yours." By summer, their 12-minute conversations had become the axis around which Margaret's world turned. She learned that Tom carried his father's watch from necessity, not sentiment. Railroad schedules allowed no margin for error. She learned he sent half his wages to his widowed mother, keeping barely enough for survival. She learned his hands were gentle despite their calluses, and that he looked at her like she was something precious and rare. Tom learned that Margaret's laughter could make Mill Valley's grimy streets seem beautiful. He learned she hummed Irish ballads while working, the same songs his mother had sung in Chicago. He learned she wore a small silver locket containing her parents' photograph, and that she dreamed of children who wouldn't grow up breathing cotton dust. By August, they progressed to holding hands during their brief walks, careful to stay out of sight from curious townspeople. By early September, Tom spoke of the future with certainty that made Margaret's heart race with equal parts hope and terror. "I've applied for transfer to the Boston-New York line," he told her one Thursday, as they stood beside the water tower, hidden from prying eyes. "Better pay, and the route, Maggie, it goes through Boston. We could have a real life there. We could get married." The word hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "Tom," she whispered, Are you certain? I'm just a mill girl. I don't know anything about city living." He cupped her face in those careful engineer's hands that knew exactly how much pressure to apply, how to hold something precious without breaking it. "Maggie O'Brien, you're not just anything. You're the smartest, most beautiful, most extraordinary woman I've ever known. I love you more than the sound of a perfectly tuned locomotive, more than the open rail and the freedom it promises. I love you enough to want to stop traveling and start living." When he kissed her beside the water tower, afternoon sun turning her hair to flame, Margaret understood why poets wrote about hearts breaking from too much joy. The transfer approval arrived September 15th. Tom would report to South Station, September 25th, to begin his new route. 10 days to change the entire course of their lives. "We'll do it, Maggie," Tom promised, eyes bright with determination. "Leave Mill Valley behind and start fresh in Boston. Just you, me, and all the dreams we can carry." Margaret said yes without hesitation, not because she wasn't terrified, but because she was more terrified of life without him. They would meet at 4 a.m. on September 23rd. Tom would stop the southbound freight long enough for her to climb aboard. By evening, they'd be in Boston. By week's end, they'd be married. She gave notice at the mill, sold her possessions, wrote to her aunt in Lawrence explaining her decision, packed a single bag with her best dress, her mother's locket, and the poetry book Tom had given her. On September 22nd, Margaret O'Brien went to bed, believing her real life would begin in a few hours. She fell asleep to rain against her window, and her heart beating time like a locomotive racing toward its destination. She had no way of knowing that by morning, her carefully constructed future would collapse into 30 years of questions that no one seemed able or willing to answer.
To understand the magnitude of what Margaret lost, you must first understand what she had found. In 1912, love between a mill worker and a railroad man wasn't just improbable. It was revolutionary in a town where social hierarchies were as fixed as the machinery that defined them. Mill Valley operated on rules as rigid as the looms that wove its fabric. Mill owners lived in grand houses on Elm Street, with wraparound porches and manicured gardens. Supervisors occupied neat row houses on Maple and Oak, close enough to walk to work, far enough to maintain respectability. Workers crowded into tenements backing against the river, where water wheel sounds mixed with babies crying and adults arguing in spaces too small for dignity. Margaret existed in that precarious space between working class and desperate poverty. Her father's position as mill mechanic had lifted the O'Briens slightly above the tenements, but his death sent them sliding toward destitution with frightening speed. Only Margaret's quick mind and quicker hands kept them from complete ruin. Tom Sullivan occupied different social territory entirely. Railroad men were travelers, citizens of the rails who belonged nowhere and everywhere. Respected for their skills, locomotive operation required years of training, but viewed suspiciously because their loyalties lay with distant companies, not local communities. In rigid small-town New England hierarchy, their love wasn't just unlikely, it was almost impossible. Yet somehow, in those precious 12-minute intervals, 3 times weekly, they created a world where such things could flourish. Their courtship was measured in stolen moments and careful words. A hand touch when Tom helped Margaret down from the platform. Shared looks lasting heartbeats longer than propriety allowed. Conversations dancing around deeper feelings, testing possibilities' waters. Tom began bringing small gifts, nothing compromising her reputation, but tokens speaking of attention. A smooth stone from Lake Champlain shores, a pressed flower from Connecticut River Valley, a poetry book purchased in Boston, carefully inscribed, "For Miss O'Brien, who understands the most beautiful journeys happen in imagination. T. Sullivan.
Margaret treasured each gift like sacred relics, keeping them in a wooden box her father had made, hidden beneath her bed where Mrs. Murphy's prying eyes couldn't find them. Nights she would hold them, trying to imagine their origin places, picturing herself traveling alongside the man who collected them for her. But it was the breakthrough moment in July that changed everything, during one of New England's legendary thunderstorms. The afternoon freight was delayed by washouts south of Worcester, giving Tom an unexpected 2-hour Mill Valley layover. Margaret, soaked from running home through sudden downpour, encountered him in Murphy's Mercantile, where he studied weather through rain-streaked windows. "Looks like I'll be here a while," he said, carefully casual. "Don't suppose you know where a fellow might wait out a storm?" Margaret glanced around the store, acutely aware of Mrs. Henderson's watchful eyes behind the counter. Propriety demanded polite conversation and moving on. Respectability required not being seen alone with a man not officially courting her. Instead, she found herself saying, "There's a covered bridge about a mile upstream. It's dry, quiet, and private." The walk to the bridge felt like the longest of Margaret's life. They moved through rain-soaked streets like conspirators, not speaking, both aware they were crossing an uncrossable line. The bridge, when reached, was a weathered wood tunnel, smelling of creosote and river water, filled with rain drumming the roof and the swollen Merrimack rushing below. For the first time, they were truly alone. "Maggie," Tom said, her name sounding like prayer, "I need to tell you something." She turned to face him in dim light filtering through the entrance, seeing in his eyes the same certainty she felt in her heart. "I love you," he said simply. "I've loved you since that first day when you looked up from the mill window. I know I have no right to say it, no right to ask anything. I'm just a railroad man with no permanent address, barely enough savings to support myself, let alone a wife. But I couldn't spend another day without you knowing the truth." Margaret felt tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "Tom," she whispered, "I love you too. I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I've loved you from that very moment. You've made me feel like I'm more than just a mill worker, more than someone merely trying to survive from day to day." When he kissed her, with storm raging around them and river running wild below, Margaret understood her life had just divided into two distinct periods, before this kiss and everything that would come after. They spent the next hour talking with intensity of people who'd been holding back enormous emotions and finally found permission to release them. Tom spoke of dreams, not just wandering dreams of a young railroad man, but specific, practical dreams, including her. "I've been saving money," he told her. "Not much, but enough to rent a small Boston apartment. There are opportunities there for women like you, Maggie. Smart women. You could work in an office or shop, take night classes, have the kind of life your mind deserves." Margaret spoke of dreams she'd barely dared acknowledge. Dreams of children growing up in clean air instead of cotton dust. Dreams of Sunday afternoons reading in a parlor with real carpet and windows opening onto something other than factory smokestacks. Dreams of growing old beside a man who saw her intelligence as gift rather than threat. "I want to give you those things," Tom said, taking her hands. "Not because you need me to, but because I want to be part of making them happen. I want to be your partner in building a life worthy of who you are." From that day,
Their relationship took on new urgency. Tom began speaking concretely about their future, making plans instead of sharing dreams. He had submitted his Boston-New York route application. The pay increase would be substantial, enough to support a small household, enough to allow Margaret to quit mill work permanently if she chose. "We could be married by Christmas," he told her one August afternoon as they walked quiet streets near the river. "I know it's fast, Maggie, but I can't see the point in waiting when we both know what we want." Margaret's practical mind cataloged reasons for caution. She barely knew his family. He'd be traveling constantly, leaving her alone in a city where she knew no one. The gap between dreaming about different life and actually living it was vast and full of unknowns. But her heart, which had spent 19 years learning to be careful and practical and realistic about what was possible for a girl like her, had other ideas entirely. "Yes," she said, the word coming out like breath she'd been holding for months. "Yes, Tom, let's build that life together."
Concrete plans began forming. Tom would secure Boston lodging and send for Margaret once established. Or better yet, if timing worked, he could arrange for freight to make an unscheduled Mill Valley stop, allowing her to ride with him to Boston. It would be irregular, possibly against company policy, but Tom was well regarded by supervisors. He was confident he could make it work. The plan crystallized in September. Tom's transfer was approved. He'd report to South Station Monday, September 25th. If Margaret was willing to trust him completely, he could arrange for southbound freight to stop in Mill Valley early Monday morning. She could climb aboard, and by evening they'd be in Boston together, ready to start their new life. "It means leaving everything behind," Tom warned. "Your job, friends, everything familiar. Once we do this, Maggie, there's no going back. Are you certain?" Margaret thought of the mill floor where she'd spent 5 years breathing cotton fibers and listening to machinery drowning out conversation and dreams alike. She thought of Mill Valley's narrow streets and narrower expectations, of assumptions that a girl like her would marry a mill worker like her father, live in a tenement like her childhood home, raise children following the same predetermined path. Then she thought of Boston, of theaters and universities and opportunities stretching beyond everything she'd ever known, of waking every morning beside a man who believed she was capable of extraordinary things. "I'm certain," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. They set the date. Monday, September 23rd, 4 a.m. The freight would make a brief, unscheduled Mill Valley stop. Margaret would be waiting on the platform with a single bag, ready to step into the future they'd planned together. Tom gave her his father's pocket watch as promise. "Keep it safe until Monday," he said, pressing warm metal into her hands. "It's been keeping perfect time for 20 years. Just like my promise to you." Margaret spent the final week in a haze of anticipation and terror. She gave mill notice, claiming family obligations requiring her to leave town. She sold possessions to other boarding house residents. She wrote letters to the handful of people who mattered, explaining her decision to seek better opportunities elsewhere. She didn't mention Tom's name in any letters. Even now, on the verge of abandoning everything for love, Margaret understood the need for discretion. If their plan failed, if something went wrong, she didn't want to compromise his railroad position. September 22nd evening. Margaret packed her single bag with the care of someone preparing for life's most important journey. Her mother's locket, Tom's poetry book, her best dress carefully wrapped in tissue paper, the few photographs she owned, and Tom's watch, which she wound carefully and held against her ear, listening to its steady tick, the sound of promises being kept, of time moving toward appointed destinations. She went to bed believing that in 12 hours her real life would finally begin. She fell asleep to rain against her window and woke to church bells tolling 4 a.m. in the distance. Time to go. Time to step aboard the train that would carry her into the future she'd dreamed of since that first moment when green eyes met blue across muddy distance between mill and station. But when Margaret arrived at the platform, bag in hand and heart hammering with excitement and fear, she discovered that some promises are broken, not by choice, but by forces beyond anyone's control. The train that should have stopped thundered through Mill Valley at exactly 4:03 a.m., its whistle screaming like something in agony, carrying neither Tom Sullivan nor any possibility of the life they'd planned together.
September 23rd, 1912, dawned gray and cold, with persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into bones and stay there. Margaret O'Brien woke at 3:30 a.m. without alarm, her body thrumming with nervous energy and anticipation that felt electric in her veins. She dressed carefully in dim light, choosing the deep blue wool dress her mother had sewn for confirmation, the finest thing she owned, appropriate for meeting her new life. She pinned her mother's silver locket at her throat and Tom's father's watch to her bodice, feeling its steady tick against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The boarding house was silent around her as she moved through her morning routine for the final time. Mrs. Murphy slept soundly on the second floor, blissfully unaware that one of her tenants was about to disappear into Massachusetts dawn. Margaret had left final week's rent on the kitchen table with a note explaining urgent family business had called her away. She carried her single bag down narrow stairs, each step measured and deliberate. No hurry. She had timed this perfectly, allowing 20 minutes to walk to the station and 10 minutes to compose herself before Tom's train arrived. Everything planned, everything ready. Mill Valley streets were empty, except for occasional cats slinking between shadows and distant sounds of early shift workers beginning their trudge toward the mill. Margaret's footsteps echoed off wet cobblestones as she made her way toward the station, breath forming small clouds in cold air. She felt strangely detached from her surroundings, as if she were already gone and this was just a ghost walking through remnants of her old life. The mercantile where she'd bought thread and buttons, the church where she'd sat through countless Sunday services dreaming of anywhere but here. Murphy's Tavern, where her father had drunk away sorrows and wages in equal measure. All of it would be memory by evening. Tonight she would be in Boston, in a clean room with Tom Sullivan, planning their wedding and future with the kind of certainty she'd never felt about anything before. The station was a small, utilitarian building serving a mill town's practical needs, freight mainly, with occasional passenger service to Lawrence or Boston. Margaret had spent countless hours here over 6 months, timing errands and walks to coincide with Tom's arrivals, learning the rhythm of his schedule, like other women learned hymn verses.
She positioned herself exactly where Tom had instructed, beside the water tower, where the train would need to stop anyway, and where she could board quickly without drawing attention from any railroad personnel who might be present. At 3:55 a.m., Margaret checked Tom's watch. 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, her entire life would change direction, shifting from the predetermined track of mill work and small-town marriage toward possibilities she could barely imagine. She thought of letters she'd left behind, careful explanations to few friends, polite notice to her mill supervisor. She'd told them she was going to Lawrence to care for an elderly relative, a lie that would buy time to establish herself in Boston before anyone came looking for answers. At 3:58 a.m., she heard the distant whistle of an approaching locomotive. Her heart began racing, not with fear, but with the kind of exhilaration she imagined birds felt discovering they could fly. This was it, the moment when Margaret O'Brien, mill worker, would climb aboard a freight train and emerge in Boston as Margaret Sullivan, wife of a railroad engineer and citizen of a larger world. The train's headlamp appeared around the bend leading into Mill Valley, cutting through pre-dawn gloom like a fallen star. Margaret smoothed her skirts, adjusted her bag, and prepared to step forward into the future she had chosen. But the train didn't slow. At 4:03 a.m., the southbound freight thundered through Mill Valley Station at full speed, its whistle shrieking a sound that seemed less like greeting than mourning. Margaret stood frozen on the platform, bag in hand, watching cars blur past in a rhythm that sounded like goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. She remained there several minutes after the train disappeared, trying to understand what had happened. Perhaps there had been miscommunication. Perhaps Tom had been unable to arrange the stop. Perhaps he would be on the next train or the one after. But as minutes stretched into an hour, then 2, Margaret began understanding that something was terribly wrong. When the 6 a.m. passenger service arrived from Boston, the regular morning train Tom sometimes drove on rotation, a different engineer was in the cab. Margaret approached him with heart hammering against ribs.
"Excuse me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was expecting to see Thomas Sullivan this morning. Has he been reassigned?" The engineer, a grizzled man named Patterson, whom Margaret recognized from previous encounters, removed his cap and shook his head sympathetically. "Tom Sullivan's been transferred sudden-like," he said. "Got word yesterday he was needed elsewhere. Family emergency, I heard. Don't know when he'll be back on this route, miss." Family emergency. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Tom had never mentioned family troubles. His mother in Chicago was well, as far as she knew. His father had been dead for years. What kind of emergency could have pulled him away without even a message? Did he leave any word for anyone in Mill Valley? She asked, hating the desperation in her own voice. Patterson's expression softened further. "I'm sorry, miss. He left Boston in quite a hurry, I'm told. Maybe when things settle down, he'll be back." Margaret thanked him and walked slowly back toward the boarding house, her bag feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. Around her, Mill Valley was waking up, smoke rising from chimneys, first shift workers emerging from homes, the familiar rhythm of a mill town beginning another day exactly like every day before. But for Margaret, the world had fundamentally changed, not in the way she'd planned, with adventure and possibilities stretching ahead, but in a way that felt like falling down a well, sudden, disorienting, with no clear way back to the surface. She spent the rest of the day in her room, telling Mrs. Murphy she felt unwell. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her stomach churned with anxiety, and her head ached from crying. She kept checking Tom's watch, as if its steady ticking could somehow undo the morning's disaster and restore the future they'd planned. Over following days, Margaret wrote letters to Boston and Maine Railroad, asking for information about Thomas Sullivan's whereabouts. Responses, when they came at all, were frustratingly vague. Mr. Sullivan has been reassigned due to personal circumstances. We cannot provide forwarding information for employees' private correspondence.
She wrote to the railroad's main office in Boston, to the dispatcher who would have authorized Tom's route changes, even to the company president. Answers were all variations on the same theme. Thomas Sullivan had been transferred. His personal information was confidential, and the company regretted they could not assist with private matters. Margaret returned to mill work, claiming her family emergency had resolved itself. Her supervisor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, made clear her position was provisional now, that he didn't appreciate workers making unreliable claims about family obligations. But Margaret barely heard his threats. Her attention was consumed by the mystery of Tom's disappearance and growing certainty that something terrible had happened to him. As September turned to October, and October to November, Margaret developed a routine that Mill Valley people began regarding as harmless eccentricity. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, she would walk to the station at 3:47 p.m. and wait for the afternoon freight. When it arrived without Tom, she would speak briefly with whatever engineer was driving, asking if there was any word, any message, any explanation for his absence. There never was. By winter, railroad men had grown accustomed to the young woman with auburn hair who appeared like clockwork, asked hopeful questions, and walked away with disappointment etched deeper into her face each time. By spring, they simply nodded respectfully and moved on with their duties, understanding that some kinds of waiting are sacred and not to be disturbed with false comfort or unwelcome advice. But what Margaret didn't know, what no one told her, was that some of those railroad men carried letters in their pockets, letters addressed to her, letters that Tom Sullivan had written in his final days, letters that someone had decided she was better off never receiving. Margaret O'Brien had become Mill Valley's ghost, haunting the station platform and carrying the weight of unanswered love like other women carried prayer books, carefully, constantly, with the kind of faith that refuses to acknowledge the possibility of abandonment. She would carry that weight for exactly 30 years, until she discovered that the cruelest kindness is sometimes letting someone believe they were forgotten, rather than telling them they were loved beyond all reason, beyond all hope, beyond all possibility of survival.
Time moves differently when you're waiting for someone who never comes home. It stretches and contracts unpredictably, so that a single afternoon can feel like eternity, while entire seasons blur past unnoticed. Margaret O'Brien learned this lesson with the thoroughness of someone who had no choice but to become an expert in the mathematics of hope deferred. But what she didn't learn, what no one told her for 30 years, was that her waiting had witnesses. People who carried pieces of the truth, like shards of broken glass, too dangerous to handle, too sharp to ignore. The first year was brutal, filled with false starts and imagined possibilities. Every knock at the boarding house door might be a telegram. Every unfamiliar face in the mercantile could be someone carrying news from Boston or Chicago or wherever Tom had been taken by whatever emergency had called him away. Margaret lived in constant, barely controlled anticipation, emotions swinging between hope and despair with exhausting regularity. She developed rituals to manage uncertainty. Every morning she wound Tom's father's watch and held it to her ear, listening to its steady tick, as if it were code that might eventually reveal its secret. Every evening she sat by her window, watching the road that led out of Mill Valley, certain that one day she would see a familiar figure walking toward her with explanations and apologies and arms ready to hold her. What she didn't see were the meaningful looks exchanged between longtime residents when she passed, the way conversations stopped when she entered Murphy's store, the careful way people avoided mentioning Chicago or railroad accidents, or the Pinkerton Detective Agency that had been asking questions around town in the weeks after Tom's disappearance. On the 23rd of each month, she made her pilgrimage to the station platform, standing in the exact spot where she had waited that September morning. It wasn't conscious decision at first, simply instinctive return to the place where her future had derailed. But as months accumulated, it became a deliberate act of faith, a way of telling the universe she was still here, still ready, still believing that promises mattered. The townspeople watched this ritual with a mixture of pity and something deeper, a discomfort that came from knowing more than they were allowed to say. Mrs. Murphy, her landlady, was more direct than most, but even she danced around the edges of truth. "Margaret, dear," she said one November evening, 6 months after the failed departure, "you're a young woman with your whole life ahead of you. This pining for a man who's clearly unable to return, it's not healthy." The pause before "unable to return" was loaded with meaning Margaret didn't catch at the time. She thanked Mrs. Murphy for concern and continued her evening vigil by the window, unaware that her landlady had received a visit from railroad officials 3 weeks after Tom's disappearance. A visit that came with warnings about discretion and the importance of letting sleeping dogs lie. Work became her refuge and prison simultaneously. The mill floor was brutal, mind-numbing labor, but it required enough concentration to provide temporary escape from questions that circled her thoughts like vultures. The repetitive motion of feeding cotton into machinery, the deafening noise that made conversation impossible, these became merciful distractions from the silence where Tom's voice should have been. Margaret threw herself into the job with the intensity of someone trying to exhaust herself into peace.
She volunteered for extra shifts, stayed late to help with equipment maintenance, gradually earned a reputation as the most reliable worker on the floor. Her supervisors, initially suspicious after her mysterious absence request, began seeing her as indispensable. By 1915, 3 years after Tom's disappearance, Margaret had been promoted to floor supervisor, a position almost unheard of for an unmarried woman in Mill Valley. The promotion came with modest pay increase and grudging respect from men who had initially dismissed her as lovesick girl playing at responsibility. But promotion also brought access to office correspondence, shipping manifests, railway scheduling documents. Margaret found herself studying these papers with desperate intensity, looking for any mention of Thomas Sullivan, any clue about what had happened to the Boston-New York route he was supposed to transfer to. She found nothing. It was as if Tom Sullivan had been erased from railroad records as thoroughly as he'd been erased from her life. What she didn't know was that certain records had been deliberately obscured, that her predecessor as floor supervisor, a man named Henry Walsh, had been quietly asked to remove any documentation that might connect Mill Valley Textile to the Thomas Sullivan incident, that the railroad company had paid the mill owners a substantial sum to ensure their cooperation in maintaining silence about what had really happened to the young engineer who had been making regular stops in their town.
The years developed their own rhythm, but it was a rhythm punctuated by near revelations that never quite materialized. In 1916, when America moved closer to the European War, increased textile demand brought new workers to Mill Valley, including a man named Patrick Hennessy, who had previously worked for the Chicago rail yards. Margaret noticed him immediately, not because he resembled Tom, but because of the way he looked at her, with recognition, pity, and something that might have been guilt. For weeks, she felt him watching her during shifts, as if he were working up courage to speak. Finally, she approached him directly. "Do we know each other, Mr. Hennessy?" she asked during lunch break, cornering him near the water barrels where they couldn't be overheard. His weathered face went pale. "No, miss. That is, not exactly. But I knew—" He stopped, glanced around nervously, then continued in a whisper. "I knew a Tom Sullivan in Chicago, railroad man. Might be the same fellow you've been asking about." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "You knew Tom? What happened to him? Where is he?" Hennessy's expression grew pained. "Miss O'Brien, there are things. Look, if you really want to know about Tom Sullivan, there's a woman in Chicago, Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski. She ran a boarding house near the rail yards. She might be able to tell you things others can't." Before Margaret could ask more questions, Hennessy walked away, and the next Monday, he failed to report for work. When she inquired, she was told he'd left town suddenly due to family obligations. Margaret wrote to Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski in Chicago, but her letters were returned marked addressee unknown. She tried variations on the name, searched Chicago directories when she could get access to them, even considered traveling to Chicago herself. But Mill Valley wages barely covered survival, let alone cross-country travel for what might be a wild goose chase. In 1917, when America entered the Great War, Mill Valley sent its young men to training camps and trenches. She watched them go with a mixture of pride and bitter envy. Pride for their courage, envy for their certainty about destinations and purposes.
She had been waiting for 5 years now, and sometimes wondered if movement toward any destination, even that might end in death, was preferable to this endless suspended animation.
The war years brought changes that might have excited Margaret under different circumstances. Women took jobs previously reserved for men. Government contracts brought new prosperity. Rigid social hierarchies began shifting as capability mattered more than gender or ethnic origin. But the war also brought darker changes. Federal agents began appearing in small towns across New England, investigating suspicious persons, monitoring railroad lines, asking questions about security and loyalty. When 2 such agents visited Mill Valley in early 1918, they spent considerable time at the station and the telegraph office before paying calls on several long-time residents. Mrs. Murphy was among those visited. Afterward, she seemed more nervous than usual around Margaret, more inclined to change the subject when Tom Sullivan's name came up in conversation. "Some things are better left buried," she said, one evening when Margaret mentioned her continued hope that Tom might return after the war ended. "Some stories don't have the endings we want them to have." There was weight behind her words that suggested knowledge rather than speculation. But when Margaret pressed for details, Mrs. Murphy claimed she'd spoken out of general wisdom rather than specific information. By 1920, 8 years after that September morning, Margaret's vigil had become part of Mill Valley's landscape, as predictable as church bells or mill whistles. New residents learned about the woman who waits for the train as part of local folklore. Children dared each other to approach her during monthly rituals, though most were too intimidated by the intensity of her waiting to actually do so. But among the older residents, those who had been in Mill Valley in 1912, there remained an undercurrent of unease when Margaret's name came up, a sense that they were all complicit in maintaining a necessary lie, though none of them seemed to know exactly what that lie protected or why it needed protection. Margaret was 31 now, which Mill Valley society considered dangerously close to spinsterhood. Well-meaning neighbors and co-workers continued introducing her to eligible men, widowers looking for practical wives, bachelors who had delayed marriage to build businesses. She was polite to all them and interested in none. "She's still carrying a torch for that railroad fellow," Mrs. Murphy would explain to anyone who asked. "Been going on 10 years now. Such a shame. She's a handsome woman and intelligent. Could have her pick of husbands if she'd just let herself move forward." But Margaret had no interest in moving forward, because forward implied leaving Tom behind, and that remained impossible. He was woven too deeply into her daily existence, too present in his absence to be dismissed as youthful mistake or lesson learned. The 1920s brought jazz-age changes even to conservative Mill Valley. Hemlines rose, hair was bobbed, young women spoke boldly about careers and independence. Margaret watched these developments with detached interest, neither disapproving nor participating. She had chosen her path in 1912, and the fact that it had led to a destination she never intended didn't change her determination to walk it faithfully. In 1925, 13 years after Tom's disappearance, Margaret was offered the position of mill superintendent, the first woman in company history to be considered for such a role. The salary would have been substantial, the prestige considerable. She could have bought a house on Elm Street, employed domestic staff, lived with comfort that had been unimaginable when she was 19 and dreaming of escape. She accepted the position, but remained in her room at Murphy's boarding house. What was the point of a large house when there was no one to share it? What was the point of luxury when the only thing she truly wanted couldn't be purchased at any price? The promotion did bring one unexpected benefit: access to the mill owner's personal correspondence files, dating back to the mill's founding. Margaret found herself with access to records she'd never seen before, including railway shipping contracts and communications with various transportation companies. It was in these files that she found the first concrete clue she'd discovered in over a decade: a letter from Boston and Maine Railroad dated October 15, 1912, thanking Whitmore Textile for their discretion and cooperation during the recent unfortunate incident involving one of our employees. The letter was signed by a railroad executive named Morrison and included a reference to compensation for any inconvenience caused by the investigation. There was no mention of Tom Sullivan by name, but the timing was unmistakable. Margaret stared at that letter for hours, reading and rereading its carefully neutral language. What investigation? What unfortunate incident? Why would the mill owners need to be compensated for inconvenience caused by something involving a railroad employee who was supposed to transfer to a different route?
She searched through more files, looking for any other mention of the incident or any record of the compensation referenced in the letter. She found nothing, which suggested that whatever records had existed had been deliberately removed. But the letter's existence proved that Tom's disappearance hadn't been simple family emergency or routine transfer. Something significant had happened, something that required corporate cooperation and financial compensation to keep quiet. For the first time in 13 years, Margaret felt she was close to real answers, but before she could pursue the lead further, she was summoned to meet with Mr. Whitmore himself. Harold Whitmore was a man in his 70s who had inherited the mill from his father and rarely involved himself in day-to-day operations. Margaret had never spoken with him directly, and his request for a private meeting in his office was unprecedented. "Miss O'Brien," he said without preamble when she arrived, "I understand you've been reviewing our historical correspondence files." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Yes, sir. I was looking for information about shipping contracts that might help us negotiate better rates with current carriers." Whitmore studied her for a long moment. "Miss O'Brien, you've been an exemplary employee for many years. Your dedication to this mill and this community has been remarkable. I would hate to see that dedication misdirected." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret met his gaze directly. "I'm not sure I understand your concern, Mr. Whitmore." "I think you understand perfectly." He leaned forward in his chair.
Some chapters in this town's history are better left closed. Some questions are better left unasked. Some young women are better served by focusing on the future rather than digging up the past. Margaret left that meeting with more questions than ever, but also with clear understanding that pursuing them might cost her the job that had become her only security. She was a single woman with no family, no resources beyond what she earned. She couldn't afford to lose her position over what might turn out to be nothing more than routine business correspondence. But she also couldn't forget the look in Harold Whitmore's eyes, the look of a man who knew exactly what she was searching for and was determined to ensure she never found it.
The late 20s brought economic troubles that would eventually become the Great Depression. Margaret, with intimate knowledge of textile production and carefully managed personal finances, weathered initial storms better than most. She even managed to keep the mill operating when other factories were closing, negotiating with creditors and workers to find solutions that kept people employed. Her success in business should have brought satisfaction, even happiness. Instead, it felt like hollow victory, achievements earned by a woman who had never intended to build a career, who had planned to be someone's wife and mother by now, whose competence was really just a refined form of waiting. By 1930, Margaret was 41 and had been mill superintendent for 5 years. She owned a small house now, not on Elm Street with mill owners, but a neat cottage on River Street, where she could sit on her front porch and see the train station in the distance. Every morning she wound Tom's father's watch. Every evening she sat on that porch and remembered conversations from 18 years ago as clearly as if they had happened that afternoon. The Depression, when it finally hit Mill Valley in earnest, brought a strange kind of relief. Economic catastrophe was something external, comprehensible, actionable. Margaret threw herself into keeping the mill operational, negotiating reduced wages instead of layoffs, finding new markets for products, doing whatever was necessary to preserve jobs that kept her community functioning. It was easier to focus on other people's crises than examine the slow erosion of her own hope. Because by 1930, even Margaret had to acknowledge that 18 years was a long time to wait for someone who might be dead, or married to someone else, or simply no longer the person who had made promises beside a covered bridge in 1912. But acknowledgement and abandonment were different things. She could admit her vigil might be futile without being willing to end it. Monthly pilgrimages to the station continued. Careful maintenance of Tom's watch continued. Preservation of space in her life for love that existed mainly in memory continued. In 1935, 23 years after that September morning, Margaret turned 46. She was the most successful businesswoman in Mill Valley's history, respected by employees, feared by competitors, consulted by town leaders on economic policy matters. She had achieved everything a woman of her generation was supposed to want: independence, financial security, professional respect. And yet,
Every night before sleep, she would hold Tom's watch to her ear and listen to its steady tick, wondering if somewhere in the vast expanse of America, a man she had loved for 4 months and waited for 23 years was listening to the same rhythm and remembering a girl who had been willing to abandon everything for 12 minutes of conversation 3 times a week.
In 1940, 28 years after Tom's disappearance, Margaret made her first concession to the passage of time. Instead of daily vigils by her window, she limited herself to monthly station visits and Sunday evenings on her porch. It wasn't that her feelings had diminished. If anything, the love she carried for Tom Sullivan had grown more precious with time, refined by years of careful tending into something that felt less like human emotion and more like religious devotion. But even devotion required some accommodation to reality. Margaret was 51 now, old enough to understand that some questions would never be answered. Some stories would never reach their intended conclusions. She had built a life around an absence, constructed meaning from emptiness, found purpose in the act of faithful waiting. Whether that made her a saint or a fool was something others could debate. All she knew was that every month, when the 23rd appeared on the calendar, she would walk to that station platform and stand where she had stood that September morning 30 years ago, keeping faith with a promise that had been broken, not by betrayal, but by circumstances she couldn't even imagine. Until 1942, when a wooden box in her attic would finally reveal that the greatest tragedy hadn't been Tom's disappearance. It had been the conspiracy of silence that kept her from understanding that sometimes the deepest love expresses itself through the cruelest sacrifice.
The wooden box Margaret found in her attic that September afternoon contained more than she had expected. Beneath Tom's letter, the one that would finally explain his disappearance, were other documents that revealed the intricate web of silence that had surrounded his fate for 30 years. There was a telegram from Boston and Maine Railroad dated September 24, 1912, addressed to Harold Whitmore personally. Sullivan matter resolved. Stop. Require your assurance of discretion. Stop. Compensation to follow. Stop. There was a bank draft for $500, an enormous sum in 1912, payment from the railroad to the mill for what the accompanying note described as cooperation in maintaining necessary confidentiality. But most shocking was a letter from Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski, the Chicago boarding house keeper, dated September 1940, just 2 years ago. It was addressed to Harold Whitmore, not to Margaret, and it revealed that Tom Sullivan's landlady had been trying to contact Margaret for nearly 3 decades. Margaret's hands shook as she read Mrs. Kowalski's words. Mr. Whitmore, I am writing to you again because I believe Miss O'Brien has a right to know the truth about Thomas Sullivan. I have written to her directly many times over the years, but my letters are always returned. I have tried to visit Mill Valley twice, but was turned away at the station by men who claimed to represent your interests. I am 83 years old now, and I cannot carry this burden much longer. The letter went on to explain that Tom's final message had been entrusted to Mrs. Kowalski with specific instructions that it be delivered to Margaret O'Brien of Mill Valley, Massachusetts. But when she had attempted to fulfill this request in late 1912, she had been contacted by railroad officials who informed her that delivering the letter would compromise an ongoing investigation and potentially endanger the very woman Tom had died trying to protect. They told me, Mrs. Kowalski wrote, that Miss O'Brien was safer believing Mr. Sullivan had abandoned her than knowing the truth about his father's crimes and his own tragic end. They said the Pinkerton agents were still hunting for anyone connected to Red Pat Sullivan, and that revealing Tom's location or fate might draw their attention to Mill Valley. I was young then and frightened, and I believed them when they said silence was the kindest thing I could offer. Margaret set the letter aside and picked up Tom's final message with new understanding. When she read it now, she could see not just his love for her, but his desperate attempt to protect her from a legacy of violence that would have destroyed any chance of the peaceful life they had dreamed of together.
Tom's letter, written on Chicago boarding house stationery in the hours before his death, was more than explanation. It was confession, apology, and love letter combined. My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, then I am already dead, and you must know that I kept my promise in the only way I could. Not by taking you away from Mill Valley as we planned, but by ensuring that the danger that followed me never reached you. I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was a coward who believed love could overcome anything, even the sins of a father I barely remembered. I thought I could give you the life you deserved without burdening you with the knowledge of what I carried. My father was Patrick Red Pat Sullivan, not the railroad worker who died in an accident as I always believed, but an outlaw who robbed banks across Illinois and Indiana in the 1890s. When I was 8 years old, my mother fled Chicago with me after he was killed by police, changed our name from Flanagan to Sullivan, and spent the rest of her life in terror that someone would recognize me and connect us to his crimes. The telegram I received September 21st wasn't just news of my mother's illness. It was warning that the Pinkerton Detective Agency had finally traced Red Pat's family to Chicago. They were offering a reward for any information about his surviving associates or relatives. My mother was dying, but she lived long enough to warn me that they would never stop hunting and that anyone connected to me would become a target. Maggie, I realized I could never give you the peaceful life I had promised. Not because I didn't love you. God knows I loved you more than my own life, but because loving me would have made you the wife of a wanted man. Every day would have brought risk of discovery, arrest, imprisonment. I couldn't ask you to live that way. My mother died Monday morning, September 23rd, at exactly 4:03 a.m., the same moment you were waiting for me on the platform. Her last words were about you. Save that girl, Thomas. Don't let Red Pat's sins destroy another innocent life.
I had three choices: disappear completely and leave you wondering forever, return to Mill Valley and tell you everything, asking you to share a life of fear and hiding, or draw the hunters away from you permanently.
I chose the third option. I let it be known in Chicago that Patrick Sullivan's son was working for the railroad under his own name. I made myself visible, trackable, a target they couldn't ignore. My plan was to lead them as far from Mill Valley as possible, then find a way to either clear my father's name or establish my own innocence. But I underestimated their determination and their indifference to distinguishing between my father's guilt and my innocence. They found me Tuesday evening in Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house, armed with warrants that were 20 years old but still valid. I tried to explain that I knew nothing of my father's crimes, that I had been a child when he died, that I had lived an honest life ever since learning the truth. They weren't interested in explanations. They were interested in justice for crimes committed before I was old enough to understand what crime meant. I managed to escape through a back window while they argued about jurisdiction, but I knew I had perhaps an hour before they tracked me down. I used that time to write this letter and arrange for Mrs. Kowalski to keep it safe until it could be delivered to you. I'm going to try to reach the rail yards and board a westbound freight. If I succeed, I may be able to disappear long enough to build a new identity somewhere far away. But even if I manage that miracle, I can never come back for you. I can never write, never send word, never risk leading them to Mill Valley and the woman I love. Maggie, I need you to understand that every moment we shared was real. Every word I spoke about our future came from the deepest truth of my heart. You made me feel like a man worth loving, capable of building something beautiful and lasting. The fact that my father's sins made that impossible doesn't diminish what we meant to each other. Don't wait for me. I'm begging you. Live your life. Find someone who can give you the children and security and peaceful future I wanted desperately to provide. Know that wherever I am, whatever becomes of me, I will carry your love as the one perfect thing in a world that has been harder than I ever imagined. All my love, always and forever, Thomas Patrick Sullivan. September 25. They found me. I'm writing this final note in the few minutes while they argue about taking me back to Illinois or trying me here. The Pinkerton agents are determined to make an example of Red Pat Sullivan's son, regardless of guilt or innocence.
I managed to give this letter to Mrs. Kowalski with instructions that she find a way to get it to you safely, but only after enough time has passed that my death can't be connected to anyone in Mill Valley. Maggie, if you're reading this, it means I didn't survive to explain in person. I want you to know that I died thinking of your smile, remembering the sound of your laughter, grateful for the few months when I was allowed to believe that someone like you could love someone like me. I kept my promise the only way I could, by ensuring that Red Pat Sullivan's legacy died with me, and that the danger that followed our family name never reached the woman who made me believe in redemption. I love you. I have always loved you. I will love you until time itself stops keeping track of broken promises and interrupted dreams. Tom. But there was more in the box. A final letter from Mrs. Kowalski, dated just 6 months ago, March 1942, addressed to Margaret directly. Somehow, this one had reached its destination. My dear Ms. O'Brien, I am dying, and I cannot take this secret to my grave. Harold Whitmore has threatened me with legal action if I contact you, but I am 85 years old and beyond caring about threats from men who value reputation more than truth. Thomas Sullivan died on September 25, 1912, shot by Pinkerton agents while trying to board a westbound freight train. He was unarmed. He was running not from justice, but from a justice system that refused to distinguish between a father's crimes and a son's innocence. His last words were your name. I have kept his watch running for 30 years, winding it every day as he asked me to do in his final letter. He said time should continue even when love cannot. He said someday you would understand that the deepest form of devotion sometimes requires the sacrifice of everything you want most. The railroad company paid substantial sums to ensure silence about Tom's death. They feared publicity about the Pinkerton investigation would damage their reputation and potentially expose other employees to similar persecution. Your mill owner was paid to ensure that no one in Mill Valley learned the truth about what happened to the young engineer who had been making regular stops in your town.
They told me, and I believed them, that you were safer not knowing, that the Pinkerton agency might investigate anyone connected to Tom Sullivan, and that ignorance would protect you better than truth. I realize now that we were all wrong, that 30 years of wondering has been crueler than knowing would have been, that you deserved the truth about a man who loved you enough to die alone rather than expose you to danger. I am enclosing Tom's father's pocket watch, which I have kept running all these years. Also his final photograph, taken the day before he died. He looks tired in it, but his eyes are gentle. Remember him that way, not as the desperate fugitive he was forced to become, but as the gentle man who loved you more than his own life. The watch is yours now. Wind it when you think of him. Let it remind you that love doesn't end with death. It continues, marking time in hearts that refuse to forget, measuring moments that matter more than all the years that came before or after. I pray this letter finds you well, and that knowing the truth brings you the peace that has been denied to you for so long. With deepest sympathy and respect, Eleanor Kowalski. P.S. There is one more thing you should know. Tom wrote other letters during his final days, letters to you that he asked me to destroy because they were too dangerous to keep. But I couldn't bring myself to burn them all. There is one more, hidden in the lining of his watch case. He wrote it on the train platform just before the agents found him.
It may be the truest thing he ever wrote." With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the back of the pocket watch. Hidden in a tiny compartment was a piece of paper, folded so small it was barely larger than a postage stamp. When she unfolded it, she found Tom's final message, written in pencil that had faded but was still legible. "Maggie, if love could bridge any distance, overcome any obstacle, survive any tragedy, I would find a way back to you. Since it can't, I am grateful for the months when we both believed it could. You taught me what it meant to hope for more than survival. That gift will sustain me, whatever comes next." Margaret sat in the gathering dusk of her attic, surrounded by the debris of 30 years of carefully maintained ignorance. The mystery that had defined her adult life was finally solved, but the answer brought no relief, only the devastating understanding that love had not abandoned her at all.
Tom Sullivan had kept his promise in the most profound way possible, by ensuring that his love for her remained pure, untainted by the fear and danger that would have destroyed any chance of happiness. He had chosen to die alone rather than live with her in terror. He had chosen her safety over his own survival, her peace over their shared future. As the last light faded from the attic window, Margaret O'Brien finally stopped waiting. Not because she had lost faith, but because she finally understood that Tom's greatest act of love had been his decision to carry their secret to his grave, protecting her from a truth that would have made happiness impossible. She had spent 30 years loving a man who had loved her enough to die alone rather than destroy her life with the sins of his father. That wasn't tragedy. It was the most beautiful love story she had ever heard. For the first time in 3 decades, Margaret didn't go to the train station on the 23rd of the month. Instead, she sat on her porch with Tom's father's watch in her hands, finally at peace with the knowledge that some loves are too large to be contained by a single lifetime, and that the highest form of devotion sometimes requires the sacrifice of everything you want most. The watch continued to tick, steady and true, keeping perfect time as it had for more than 30 years, not marking the hours of waiting, but celebrating the moments of connection that had made 2 young people believe, however briefly, that love could overcome any obstacle. In the end, perhaps it had.
Some stories aren't about happy endings. They're about love that burns so brightly it illuminates everything it touches, even when, especially when, that love is forced to exist in the realm of memory rather than reality. Margaret O'Brien loved Thomas Sullivan for 4 months and waited for him for 30 years. But the love was real for both of them every single day, and that made it eternal in a way that ordinary happiness could never be. Because the greatest love stories aren't about getting what you want. They're about discovering what you're willing to sacrifice for someone else's happiness, even when that sacrifice breaks your heart beyond repair. And sometimes the cruelest kindness is letting someone believe they were forgotten, rather than telling them they were loved beyond reason, beyond hope, beyond all possibility of survival. Margaret kept the watch running until the day she died, 23 years later. When they found her, peaceful in her bed on a September morning, the watch was still ticking against her chest, still keeping perfect time, still marking the rhythm of a love that had transcended death, distance, and the well-meaning lies of people who thought ignorance was kinder than truth. Time, as it turned out, was the only promise that could never be broken.